Good evening, and thank you all very much for joining us here in this beautiful theater at amerikahaus, Munich, and a warm welcome to our audience online who's watching us on our YouTube live channel. My name is Bartley Grosser-Richter, and I am the current president of the Yale Club of Germany and the founder of Munich Dialogues on Democracy, and it's a joint venture between us and our partners here at amerikahaus. So tonight is part of a series in the run-up to the US elections. And our topic is what's new about the new American right. Since we were together last end of May, before the summer break, a few things have changed. I did not have Tim Waltz on my bingo card when we saw each other, to say the least. And we also didn't know when we scheduled this event that last night was going to be the vice presidential debate. So we've got a bit more than we thought in new material to explore in the context of our topic. Our format for tonight is going to be a talk for about a half an hour, and then I'll come back up to moderate a Q&A. So you can, as always, use Slido here in the theater. You can scan and just give in your questions, #amerikahaus. And from home, you can go to slido.com, #amerikahaus, and put in your questions. And we'll try to get to as many as we can in the time that we have. A special treat for those of you who are physically here tonight. We know that you have a choice, and it's a big Oktoberfest week, and so we have an Oktoberfest-themed reception for everybody afterwards. So plan on staying and enjoying a dinner and a beer with us. We will also have books in German and English and a book table where you can get your book signed. So. It's my great honor to welcome back tonight Jan-Werner Müller, Professor Jan-Werner Müller, for his third time with us. So Jan, you are officially a fan favorite. He asks for brevity in his introductions, so I'm just going to say that he's professor for political theory at Princeton University, the author of several award-winning books. I'll mention the 2016 What is Populism, which was translated into over 20 languages, worldwide bestseller, and called Essential Reading by several essential outlets. Then there's Furcht and Freiheit für einen anderen Liberalismus, for which he won the prestigious Bavarian Book Prize in 2019. And his latest, Democracy Rules, a work that took us back to the basics on what exactly democracy is and how we can reinvent our social contract. In addition to regular contributions in the Süddeutsche, the Frankfurter Allgemein, the NZZ, Le Monde, The Guardian, the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, etc. He is currently short-term visiting fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies at the LMU in Munich. His work has taken on the very idea of what democracy is, why we should value it, and how to defend it. His proposed topic tonight is what's new about the new American right. And so I went to his latest book, and I was struck by an observation in the very beginning that seems applicable for tonight. He writes, a quick glance at history would suggest that there are few, possibly no instances of democratic majorities clearly deciding to be done with democracy. Fascist thugs marched on Rome, but Mussolini didn't. He arrived by sleeper car from Milan, because liberal elites, and not least the king, had decided that the future Duce should have a try at cleaning up the mess of parliamentary politics. Obviously, his fascist party had highly committed supporters, as did the National Socialists in Germany. But there as well, the crucial decision to empower Hitler was made by parts of what might as well be called the conservative establishment of the day. Those searching for one-line lessons from history should take note. Apparently, it's not the people who decide to be done with democracy. It's the elites. So that seems like an interesting bridge to our topic tonight. And with that, I'll turn the microphone over to you, Jan, to expand on this. And then I'll look forward to our conversation later. Welcome to Munich.
Thank you, Bartley, for the very kind introduction, and also thank you for that indeed very relevant quote, which probably made half the online audience tune out, saying, oh no, it's another crazy Marxist, you know, not again, not again. I don't know how many people in this room, or online for that matter, share an experience which one hears about increasingly often in the United States. The experience of waking up or catching oneself thinking, this can't be happening. Or rather, this can't be happening again. He's running again. He might win again. If he doesn't win, he's going to contest the outcome again. How can this possibly have happened? I'll try to give an answer to that question and the larger meaning of what we're living through at the moment in three parts. First, on a more historical note, how did we get here? I want to highlight three important factors. Some are about conscious political decisions. Some are more structural factors. Then secondly, in answer to the question that the title of the talk suggests, what is really new? I want to emphasize what are indeed new, for shorthand, Trumpist tactics that we're witnessing, tactics which basically bet on an all-out counter-majoritarian, or if you like, outright anti-majoritarian strategy. Then add a few words about something that really is new, entirely new, you might say, namely that in addition to these tactics, you now also have intellectuals, even professors, God forbid, who basically justify these anti-majoritarian strategies. That's really new, and I'll say more about this in a second. And then lastly, third and final part, two potentially larger lessons of this entire story, larger being shorthand for maybe also applicable in places like Germany and maybe Bavaria in particular. So, on to the first part. How did we get here? Three important factors. Probably some of them pretty well known at this point. First, of course, in answer to the question, how could the party of Lincoln, the GOP, have ended up in the place where it is today? In a place where some of us feel like, okay, this is like time travel into the worst periods of the Cold War. Kamala is a communist. She wants to turn the country into some kind of Marxist gulag. I spare you all these stories about supposedly pet-eating immigrants, etc. You know, stuff that the KKK could have said and did, and similar stuff they did actually say. How could this possibly have happened? Well, it's not really a secret that when the Democratic Party in the 1950s and 1960s basically turned out to be the major advocate for civil rights, the GOP took a different path. Or as Barry Goldwater, presidential candidate in 1964, famously put it, you have to go hunting where the ducks are. What did he mean? Basically meant all the Southern whites who didn't like the direction that the Democratic Party was taking and who were now susceptible to a message that reaffirmed, you know, the old Southern order that more or less consciously, more or less directly played on what is sometimes politely in political science called racial resentment. It's maybe worth stressing in a German context that this strategy was also very evident with a figure who is often still mentioned today among American conservatives as somebody who one would want to go back to, somebody who is sort of the last symbol of a decent kind of republicanism. And that person is, of course, Ronald Reagan, who also in Germany, I dare say, probably still enjoys a certain reputation as the man who played some role in ending the Cold War, bringing down the wall, etc., etc. But I think it's important to say, and it's also important to say vis-à-vis all these conservatives who now say, oh, if only we could go back to Reagan, it would all be different. That, of course, Reagan in the 1960s was against the Civil Rights Act, was against the Voting Rights Act, and infamously started his presidential campaign in 1980 in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the place where in the 60s 3 civil rights activists had been murdered, and where he also then basically said, I'm all for states' rights. And everybody at the time knew what that really meant. So it's a basically pretty clear through line. Point is not that every Republican in the last 50 or 60 years was on board with this strategy, but it was certainly part of the overall package. Second important factor, maybe less well known. There is something very, very peculiar about the American media landscape, something that really does not exist in this form anywhere else in the world. It's something that has been demonstrated very conclusively by a number of our colleagues at Harvard, in particular Yochai Benkler, who basically say that what we find in the US today is a more or less self-enclosed right-wing media ecosphere. And by self-enclosed, our colleagues mean that the people who are in this media sphere do not even have contact with relatively mainstream media outlets such as, let's say, the Wall Street Journal. I mean, the Wall Street Journal opinion page is its own story, but everything else that is in the paper is, of course, pretty reliable because, hey, if you're on Wall Street, you don't want to deal with misinformation or disinformation. You want to know what's really going on. Point is that people who are in this world, and you all know the story about, certain cable TV stations that are central to this world as well, basically do never have anything that for shorthand you could call a fact check. Now, that's not to say that nobody on the left, nobody on the left ever lies, or there couldn't be misinformation or disinformation on the other side of the political spectrum. Of course, that can exist. But the point is that there, sooner or later, people will have contact with, take your pick, the New York Times, the Washington Post, some other outlet that tells them that, the latest, how to put this politely in the language of political science, batshit crazy conspiracy theory is actually not correct. So it's a very asymmetrical situation. And, this almost seems like ancient history now, but if you ever ask the question, how the hell in 2016 did people ever get this idea that, yes, there was this pizzeria in Washington, and in the basement there was a pedophilia ring that was controlled by Hillary Clinton and so on. Any normal person would say, it takes a lot of steps to find this remotely plausible. And then it takes only 1 or 2 steps to take a gun and, as the famous phrase at the time went, self-investigate. But Benkler and his colleagues have actually reconstructed in great detail how that story came about, how it was basically transmitted through key actors in this right-wing media ecosphere, including plenty of folks on, you won't be surprised to hear, Fox News, who didn't outright say this is true, but who had some kind of hint that, oh, there's a story there, there's something going on. Jeffrey Epstein, of course, was part of that story. I can say more about later if you like. So people were kind of primed to believe that there really was something to that whole sort of set of ideas. As I said, this is an American peculiarity, but it has persisted. It's still very important today, and it makes it more plausible to basically have a strategy where you feel, well, if we can mobilize all the people who are in that self-enclosed right-wing media ecosphere, we already are a long way towards perhaps winning. Third and last factor I want to mention. This has something to do with political parties. And this actually does not only apply to the GOP. As plenty of political scientists have pointed out, American political parties have become hollowed out. They basically don't have much by way of internal structures, real internal decision-making processes, anything that could allow a party to A, act in a coherent way overall, and B, more particularly, and this applies, of course, really only to the Republicans, prevent a situation where a political party becomes transformed into something that looks more like a personality cult. That's a point that matters more generally from the point of view of democratic theory. I know that probably many of you say, yeah, of course, in Germany we're so blessed. It even says in the basic law that every political party must be internally democratic, which, in the eyes of critics then translates into endless evenings in, various beer halls and pubs and so on, where, yes, you can have, debate and pluralism, but usually what it means is, it's usually an older man who doesn't have to get up early in the morning or take care of children, who is going to pontificate the longest and win the debate. All that is true by way of criticism. But it still remains also true that if you don't have this kind of internal pluralism, you have no restraints on party leadership. If the Republican Party were a normal political party, January 6th would not have been possible. There would have been some restraint at one point along the lines of, this is it, you can't keep doing this, we are a party, which also means we have a long-term program, which also means we can afford to lose one election, we will try again the next time. It's not just about one person in his 70s. But if you are a personality cult, the logic is entirely different, and you cannot really afford to lose an election. So that's a more structural factor in terms of what has changed and why we now face problems that we would not have had in quite the same way 20 or 30 years ago. All right, second chapter. What's really new and specific to our moment? 3 points about what for shorthand we might call Trumpist tactics, and then, as promised or threatened, a slightly more intellectual point about some of our colleagues who are very educated, are very sophisticated in both their philosophies and sometimes even in their theologies, who are willing to justify, basically, to put it bluntly, letting democracy go, if necessary. So the tactics can probably, especially if you are fond of alliterations, can be summed up with 3 L's: lawfare, lying, and letting loose. What do I mean? Lawfare refers to the tactic that says, okay, we kind of know that many of our policies are not super popular. We know that when you really think about it, Trump has lost every single election. The popular vote in 2016, since he was obviously always the dominant figure, also for every midterm election, he kind of lost more or less all the midterms, or at least didn't do as well as people had hoped. And of course, he lost in 2020, even though I understand there are some people on television recently who are not quite sure about that fact. If you know that, then of course, the incentive all along has been to not really go after people in the sense of mobilizing supporters, but go after the process, making it more difficult for people to vote, trying to throw people off the rolls, or contest the outcomes once you know that you may not have really won. So just now, about 90 lawsuits have already been filed that basically aim at preparing a situation after November 5th where the outcome is going to be called into question. Doesn't mean that these efforts will succeed, but it's not a crazy thought and it's not conspiracy theory to say that this is already certainly part of the plan. And that is what is often abbreviated as lawfare. So you basically use the law, you use the legal system to get the political outcome that you want. What about what I very bluntly, forgive me, called lying? Again, if you know that your program ultimately might not be that popular, you have to, on one level, simply deceive people about what you truly stand for. And this is not my personal view. Plenty of colleagues in political science have said, look, when you actually go to voters and tell them, the GOP wants to simply reduce taxes for the rich again, they say this can't be true. They can't really mean that. Surely that's not actually the program. You must be wrong about this. But of course that is ultimately the program. So it becomes very important to basically keep telling people different stories, make up stories, distract people in all kinds of ways. As our colleague Jay Rosen, the media critic from NYU, has pointed out, the attacks on what globally you can call the media, or what he calls the counterfactual, although it might be more precise to say the anti-factual, is connected to what I've been calling the counter-majoritarian or anti-majoritarian strategy. If you know that basically what you stand for isn't truly popular, you have to resort to sowing confusion or simply telling people something that basically you know isn't correct. And those of you who may have been up last night and watched the VP debate will have seen this in action in terms of, oh, Trump tried to save the Affordable Care Act. Things like this, which obviously are not true. And even better moment, you might say, emblematic moment always, almost, somebody basically saying, don't you dare to fact check me. That's not allowed. That's sort of not part of the deal. And you think if that's your official, quasi-official position, you wonder, how can this possibly be? Obviously, you can well say, but look, sometimes facts are in dispute. That's true, of course. But on very, very basic matters, there's plenty of stuff that isn't really in dispute. And if you basically bet on a tactic that says, no, we have to keep people confused about some of these basic facts, that's something very, very different from what a more or less normal center-right party would do. Lastly, what I call letting loose. That's a very polite way of saying that there is now a willingness to either instigate or condone violence, which is new. Again, that's not my personal view. Plenty of surveys have shown that Republican voters are willing to go on record as saying, yes, it's permissible to use force to defend our way of life, or to defend the way of life of what Trump likes to call the real people. Now, I'm not saying that this applies across the board to every single person who votes for the GOP, everybody who's a politician in the GOP. I'm not generalizing that way. But again, it's a very, very asymmetrical situation. You only find this on the right. You only find actual militias who might basically be on board with implementing this desire for supposed collective self-defense on the right. And in the run-up to November 5th, it does feel, to many of us, a little bit like a loaded gun, that people are ready to do something. Maybe they won't in the end, but it would be very, very naive, especially, of course, after January 6th, not to take that possibility seriously. So these were the 3 L's. What about the intellectual stuff I hinted at? So what I think is truly new is a current of thought that is today often called post-liberal, even though you might say a more accurate description would simply be anti-liberal. Liberal not in the partisan US sense of, vaguely center-left in one form or another, but more in the sense of, let's say in the German context, Carl Schmitt. People who really fundamentally call into question liberal democracy as we know it. What does that mean more particularly? There's a sort of soft version of this, which comes down to saying, if you think you know what the right morality is, why shouldn't you use the state to enforce that morality? In other words, unlike a certain type of liberal who would say, look, the state shouldn't tell people how to live and what to believe, the state should be, broadly speaking, neutral about questions like this, you basically mobilize whatever you have by way of state resources to enforce what you think the correct morality is. A much less abstract way of putting all this is that many people who like this idea also love a particular European politician and a particular European country. And no prizes for guessing that, of course, the person is Viktor Orban and the country is Hungary. Plenty of American post-liberals have made what by now feels like an established pilgrimage to Budapest, where they say, look, this is great. This is finally a conservative who means it. This is also somebody who's claimed the mantle of Christian democracy. Not like Angela Merkel, who was in the end willing to kind of put up with same-sex marriage and was basically a liberal. I mean, never mind whether that's really true or not. Here's somebody who really believes it and who's really saying, yes, we're going to enforce certain things, and we're not simply going to go with, the trends of the time and adapt to all these, supposed liberal tyrannies of, same-sex marriage, LGBTQ, whatever, etc. No, here's somebody who's basically willing to use the state to enforce a morality which is more or less informed by Christian beliefs. Now, just as a footnote to the footnote, we can come back to this later if you like, it's sort of an interesting question whether some of these people who make this pilgrimage to Budapest really don't know what else is going on in the country, by which I mean autocratic kleptocracy. In other words, whether they are what in the 20th century would have been called useful idiots, people who in the 20s went to the Soviet Union and said, oh, this is great. All the workers are super happy. I went to the camps. You know, people are really enjoying it. It's fantastic. Or whether they kind of know. And they're basically saying, yeah, it's acceptable. It's acceptable to have a certain kind of corruption. It's acceptable to treating certain people with a certain amount of cruelty because we ultimately get what we really want. And the second option is one that I think also points us in the direction of the, if you like, harder version of this new anti-liberalism. People who are basically quite openly saying, look, if it's between democracy and my favorite understanding of morality, such as certain understanding of Catholic natural law, I'm going to go with my understanding of what's right. And I'm not going to go with the relativism of democracy, where, you know, arbitrary majorities who believe the wrong thing, who I think might be immoral, are going to be empowered. Now, this is new. I think people would not have said this quite so openly 10, let alone 20 or 30 years ago. Some of these folks are very smart. Some of these folks are at, God forbid, Harvard. Some of these people are extremely good at trolling liberals, so they love to sprinkle, you know, their pronouncements with a little bit of Carl Schmitt or some super arch-reactionary 19th century French thinker. They're not a huge group, but they themselves would tell us, look, it doesn't take huge groups. History is not really made by the people. This is more or less a direct quote from an infamous 19th century French reactionary, Joseph de Maistre, great counter-revolutionary early in the 19th century. Maistre already said, people don't make history. It's small groups of highly determined people. And that's what these new anti-liberals would say too. That, you know, if they really know what they're doing and they somehow get hold of the levers of power, things can really change. I don't want to sound alarmist, I don't want to make too much of this, but since the question was, what's new about the new American right, this is an important part of the answer. And again, it's not conspiracy theory to say that the person who was on American TV last night, you know, debating a very, very nervous coach, is very close to that group and is certainly willing to be inspired by these post-liberals. I'm not making any predictions about what would happen if his ticket wins, but it's certainly important to understand that this connection is there. Final footnote in this chapter, if I may, you know, it's probably if you invite professors, you know, footnote after footnote. For those of you who are interested in these questions, these intellectual figures really put an emphasis on getting their theology right. So they know that, especially as Catholics, they have to have a story about how papal encyclicals that basically would have conclusively pointed in the direction of not just religious freedom, but basically saying you cannot use the state to force people to follow a certain kind of morality. You cannot pursue what in the 19th century and still today is known as integralism, where essentially the state becomes an instrument of spiritual powers. They basically feel, okay, they have to argue against these authoritative pronouncements from Rome. So that's also what they're working on. They're basically telling us that everything that happened in the 60s in terms of the Vatican changing its views was either mistaken or can be reopened as a question or can be interpreted differently. And they're not traditionalists. Maybe that's also worth emphasizing in a, if I may, Bavarian context. So they don't care about things like, oh, we should have kept the Latin Mass, and that's really important. It's not about questions like this. It's really about the hardcore political questions. And in that sense, you might say, it's also very Carl Schmitt-like. It's basically saying, look, ultimately when the chips are down, the question is not, is the priest going to wear this dress or that dress? What are you going to hear in church? Who cares about these, more or less arbitrary aesthetic questions? Question is, who rules? And right now, in their eyes, it's tyrannical, at the same time hypocritical liberals who, supposedly speak in favor of toleration, but who themselves are super intolerant and want to force everybody into, well, all the usual stuff, same-sex marriage, drag queen story hour, etc., etc. And that's basically what they think they have to stop. And you can only stop it with power. So I'll finish that chapter and get to my final 2 points, the perhaps larger lessons from all these stories. Number 1, and you might say it's almost a banality in certain ways. Political identities solidify over time. In 2015 and 2016, I would say there was no MAGA movement. There was no Trumpist movement. Of course, today, there is, and it's very powerful, and nobody quite knows what to do with it. Nobody on the American right who considers themselves, anti-racist, sane, anti-MAGA in one form or another, has really come up with a strategy of what to do with, or rather about, or even more bluntly, against this movement. It's another way of saying, sometimes, if history had gone a bit differently, if certain actors had said, okay, stop, that's it, we're not supporting this, we're not letting this just develop and then assume that it can be reversed, we would be in a different situation. And if I may, I'll put it even more bluntly, things would have been possible in Germany in 2015 and 2016, which today, of course, have become much more difficult in terms of defending democracy. Second larger point. If you look back on the evolution of the Republican Party, I think there was always a sense that ultimately party elites were in control, that they could basically turn up the volume of, again, to put it very bluntly, a certain racism, a certain more or less outright willingness to delegitimize the other side. Think back, for instance, to Newt Gingrich, the Speaker of the House in the 1990s, who already told his colleagues in the GOP, whenever you talk about Democrats, you must use particular words. And the list of words that he sent around included, for instance, the word traitor. That's not really how political adversaries in a normal democracy talk about each other. But there was always the sense that you could control this, that it wouldn't get out of hand somehow. And of course, what members of these right-wing elites eventually learned was that no, you cannot control these processes. And in a certain way, Trump was the revenge, was in a sense the living disapproval of this idea that you can stay in control. The New York Times journalist Ezra Klein has put this, I think, in a very good way, against this still popular image that the GOP as a party was, as a sort of large ship of state, was cruising along on the calm seas of responsible statesmanship, and then this sort of pirate called Trump hijacks the vessel and steers it into, the rapids of populism and the hurricanes of whatever fanaticism and so on. Against this image, Klein simply said, look, Trump didn't hijack the Republican Party. Trump understood the Republican Party. He understood what had happened to at least parts of the base and what could be done with the beliefs that had been reinforced by many other people who, would have had plausible deniability in terms of racism, who would have said, but look, we also stand for all these other things, or we're even trying to reorient ourselves, as some party elites did try to do after the 2012 election loss by Mitt Romney. In other words, it's an illusion to think that you can sort of do a little bit of something that deep down is dangerous, and stay in control. Why do I mention this? I mention this because if you look at what's happening in many European countries today, for shorthand, the mainstreaming or the normalization of the far right, it is very often via nominally center-right politicians who say, okay, let's make some concessions. Let's talk a little bit like them. Or, very specifically also, okay, people seem to be responding to all this culture war stuff. You know, they're so worried about all this incomprehensible gender nonsense and which toilet you can go to and cannot go to and so on. So yes, people are very worried about this. Let's do a little bit of this, but we'll stay in control. You know, we can tune, we can sort of, turn it down again if necessary. And as our colleague Cas Mudde, the Dutch scholar who teaches in the US, has I think rightly pointed out, for, broadly speaking, more centrist or bourgeois voters, this kind of culture war stuff is the entryway drug as far as the far right is concerned. This is how you start. And once you're on this sort of path, you eventually go for the harder stuff. But not initially. Nobody wants to be seen as an extremist. Nobody wants to be seen as, oh, I'm now in the same boat as, take your pick, Marine Le Pen, Herbert Kickl, or somebody from this country. That you can imagine as the worst that the AfD has on offer right now. So my point is, people have to hold the line, or what, of course, everybody in this country now calls the firewall. And people should not give in to the temptation of saying, oh, let's just do a little bit, but we'll stay in control, and we can turn it up and we can turn it down as we see fit. You lose control at a certain point. And once you've lost control, it is very hard to, you all know the end of the sentence because it reminds us of the glorious days of Brexit, take back control. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah, you can hear me. Good thing we've got beer afterwards, huh? This is...
Wo bleibt das Positive?
Yes. However, very true. Yeah, I had quite a few questions written up, and you hit on many of them already. Why don't we start with what's your biggest takeaway from the debate last night?
Okay. Not sure I should go on the record with this, because I reveal myself to be a bad citizen. But because I was traveling to Munich last night, I did not see the debate in its entirety. So that's the preface. From what I've seen, the snippets I've seen, I think James David Vance did what he was supposed to do, which is present a more civil, polite, acceptable face of Trumpism. And as many observers have pointed out, seems like for many years he's always been willing to say what certain people wanted to hear, except it didn't entirely work because, in a sense, he was put on the spot in terms of who won in 2020. And, well, you all know the answer that he gave, or rather the answer that he refused to give. And I think in a normal world, which is to say a world where fact-checking is not some crazy partisan thing, in a world where journalists could say, look, we are sort of in charge of this process, and you, the politicians, want something from us. They would have simply either said, okay, please answer the question, and if you don't answer the question, this is over. Because it's not acceptable in a democratic context to pretend that nothing happened, or that this doesn't mean anything, or this is just like, let's discuss the federal minimum wage, as if it's just another policy question as to whether you accept an election outcome.
There were quite a few references to Tim Snyder's "do not obey in advance" when the moderators said ahead of time that they weren't going to fact check. I don't know if that's too extreme, but
yes. So this is, I think, one instance where, in the broadest sense, liberals have a lot of thinking to do. So I think it's become very clear since 2016 that it's much easier to basically intimidate the press than one would have thought.
Yeah.
many, I mean, I don't mean this as a sort of billige Medienschelte, but it's simply a fact that there's so much pressure on journalists in the United States that many journalists, again, I'm picking up, I think, a very neat formulation from Jay Rosen, replace truth-seeking with refuge-seeking. What does that mean concretely? It means concretely that they go for something that, of course, they kind of learned in journalism school, and that in the normal democracy is totally fine. This party says this, the other party says that. But of course, in a system where, as I've been trying to underline several times, we now have a profoundly asymmetric situation. This kind of, what is sometimes now called both sidesism, things like the two parties live in their own reality. Yes, that's not false, but in some instances, one party is a hell of a lot closer to reality than the other one. Or both parties, more or less recent headline from the paper of record, both parties trying to convince people with housing policies. With all due respect, even though he's a builder of sorts, I don't think Donald Trump has ever thought about housing policies in his entire life. And yes, last night it seems that, so Vance has a housing policy, which comes down to mass deportation, or if you want to put it more bluntly, a certain kind of ethnic cleansing. Now, at a certain level of abstraction, you can say, oh, they both are competing on housing policy. But it's this incredible fear of being seen as partisan that leads many journalists to basically signal that things are normal when they are not normal. Now, I understand that, and it's the same in Germany, of course, many of them are worried that they don't want to be seen as, oh, we're now part of the resistance, we're totally partisan, and so on. And it's a difficult challenge, because there are many policies where you can reasonably disagree. And obviously, if as a journalist you every single time say, oh, the right wants this, but it's undemocratic, you discredit yourself. I get that. But it's not too much to ask that journalists, at least occasionally, try to be, sorry if this sounds very academic, theorists of democracy, and say that, look, basically disputing an election outcome is not in the same realm as some of the other stuff where you can have reasonable disagreements.
What I had written down was that I wanted to talk about the media sane-washing the extreme rhetoric. Trump will go out and I find recently he's sort of hit a new level in lying the past couple of weeks. And he's talking, it's not, hurricane relief, even just flat out lying and saying the governor has not been able to talk to the president, but the governor has talked to the president. Those are basic facts. And he just says it, and then the media says Trump expressed his opinion about hurricane relief. And I find this sane washing to be really frustrating, what you said. So we have a question. What are your ideas about dampening social media echo chambers to reduce the propagation of falsehoods and memes? Is that in your wheelhouse?
We have 3 hours left to answer this simple question.
All right.
Okay. 2-3 points in response. So first of all, yes, echo chambers are real, filter bubbles are real. But unlike what people sort of tended to say in 2016, when this came in very handy, very quickly, as an explanation of the double shock of Trump and Brexit, we now know a little bit more empirically about what actually happens online. And it seems that these initial fears of echo chambers / filter bubbles were vastly exaggerated. And in a sense, it might again be a sort of moment for self-criticism, because I think many of us were telling each other this story about echo chambers. So we were actually creating an echo chamber about echo chambers, confirming that, the problem is crazy people all get together online and, reaffirm crazy beliefs and so on. Again, I'm not denying that things like this exist.
Have you been to an American Thanksgiving?
That's a different story.
I mean, these people, okay.
Again, I'm not saying that, I was saying earlier, there is a self-enclosed ecosphere.
Yeah.
I made the point. But, and that's a decisive thing, yes, there are echo chambers online, there are echo chambers in social media, but the peculiar American self-enclosed world is not a product of social media. And that's really important, because otherwise, every democracy in the world will sooner or later have the kinds of problems that the US has right now. But that's not a predetermined outcome. And I think we should generally resist the temptation of a certain kind of tech determinism which is never 100% wrong, but usually kind of not really the explanation. The kind of thing where people say, oh yeah, Gutenberg invents something, and boom, religious civil wars. Radio, Hitler. TV, McCarthy. They're not totally wrong, of course, but it's never the simple line from A to B. And the same way now. This self-enclosed American right-wing media ecosphere is not the result of the internet. It's the result of regulatory decisions that were made in the 1980s and 1990s under Reagan. They have much more to do with cable TV and radio. If you ask what is the medium with which Americans still spend most time, the answer is, of course, radio. Because if you think about the enormously long commutes that people have, you're not checking your Facebook feed. No, you're listening to Rush Limbaugh or some other intellectual voice that explains to you how the world really works.
He's gone. We've lost Rush this time.
Well, plenty of competitors for that spot. I'm just saying, it matters, but I think it's always important not to kind of fall for this, basically then defeatism, because if the technology predetermines the outcome, not much we can do. Right. So that's sort of all the. I know it's not hugely positive as a message, but just to kind of put things in perspective. In terms of what can actually be done. Well, I think as has been confirmed amply in the last couple of years, as we've witnessed what happens if a far-right activist takes over a platform. It's a real problem if we don't have a certain pluralism of platforms. It's almost a banality. The Biden administration has been saying the same thing. This is their whole antitrust narrative about it can't be right, that you concentrate power in quite this way. Mm-hmm. Plenty, of course, to be said for moderation policies, for user rights, for all these things that, are solutions, except they require a certain amount of goodwill among not just one party, but maybe two parties. And for obvious reasons, that goodwill isn't there.
Right. That feeds into the next question that people have voted up. Why are arguably intelligent and successful people like Musk, Thiel, Schwarzman starting to support Trump? And what's in it for them, or is it personal belief?
Look, I don't live in their heads.
Yeah.
I'm reluctant to answer. Then again, as hopefully also came out of the quote that you read at the beginning, we should not be totally shocked that wealthy people occasionally say, yes, this is acceptable because I put tax cuts first. That's just how some people think. In some other cases, I think it's more complicated. I think some of these figures do have strong belief systems. This is more speculative, but some of them, I think, are willing to say, well, democracy is not necessarily the best system. There might be something else that is preferable, and be quite willing to gesture at that and be willing to basically use what they see as an instrument. So, of course, they don't respect Trump as a figure, but they say it's an instrument that we can use to reshape the country in forms that we see fit in various forms. But that's much more specific. As plenty of other observers have pointed out, yes, plenty of people in Silicon Valley don't like Lina Khan. They don't like what the Biden administration has been doing about antitrust policies and about their particular business model of basically cashing in at a certain point. So you can say that's rational on a certain level. So it's not that these people are stupid or anything. On another level, you really wonder, look, given what you already have, is it worth to basically go down this path? How are you going to explain to your grandchildren that you were complicit in what was happening in 2024?
I think you're imposing your set of values on those people.
Might be. But look, I'm not equating these situations. Many of us who grew up in this country have always asked, why didn't people say anything? How was it possible? How could people not have spoken now? How they could not have seen the warning signs? Again, I'm not equating the two situations. Don't get me wrong. But in terms of some of the basic mechanisms, that's what I try to start out with, where you feel like, how can this be happening? How have we now arrived at a situation where one party basically, has a convention where people hold up these signs saying mass deportations now?
Yeah. Yeah. There was one of those intellectuals that J.D. Vance hangs out with gave a speech last week, and he said something along the lines of, we need a CEO. This was out of the Silicon Valley group. We need a CEO, we don't need a president, and a CEO is just, it's a synonym for dictator. And so this is what, behind the doors, that's sort of what, I think for me the shock in the debate last night was how eloquently and calmly J.D. Vance sort of whitewashed Project 2025. And all of this stuff that we know he's actually hanging out with, which is why we want to talk about it. And it came across as very sort of palatable until he couldn't answer who won the election.
So this is not new. I mean, there are plenty of libertarian philosophers who, when pushed, would say, you know, there's really something to be said for monarchy. And we should not be surprised that some of these people have, you know, deeply authoritarian belief systems. They do think that people are irrational. They do think democracy is dangerous, trade unions are evil, and so on. Again, none of that is really new, but this potential link now to the White House that certainly is new.
And one cheeseburger away from being president.
In this form, but also the willingness of some of these actors to kind of tip their hand and say, look, you know, actually that's sort of what you're going to be getting if that's the way.
Okay, so you mentioned something earlier that I absolutely want to come back to, but for now I've got. Trump has stated that he will not run for president again if he loses. What do you think will happen with the MAGA movement and its followers?
So that's going to be up for grabs in a certain way. Again, I would emphasize the point that existing models of what to do, example, some of you may recall the current governor of Virginia, so a former head of the Carlyle Group, so as much old-style Republican in terms of, you know, supposedly responsible business person, you know, rational, mainstream, etc. When he won, this was sort of touted as a way back to a different form of conservatism, because he didn't go out and say crazy stuff that would have pleased.
We're talking Glenn Youngkin.
Glenn Youngkin, yeah. That would have pleased the MAGA movement. But what was not always mentioned is that on the ground there were plenty of people who were, forgive the metaphor, who were giving red meat to people on the ground, and who were making up stories about, oh, if you send your kid to school, you know, he will come back as a she, etc., etc. I mean, all the crazy stuff that people get so riled up about. So they kind of had a strategy that goes back to what I was warning against. They thought, okay, we can do this, but sort of behind the scenes, and we're in charge, and we keep this under control in a certain way. So that's certainly a model. I just wouldn't bet the house that ultimately it can pan out quite like this. What I think was always implausible was the scenario that some people painted, which was, okay, you take out Trump, but then you put in a much smarter guy, like, you know, take your pick, Josh Hawley or somebody else, who much more technocratic, and then it's also always going to be the same. I mean, frankly, it took, maybe not in your case, but in my case, it took me a long time to really understand the enormous capital that Trump had as basically the most publican American who ever lived. And there's a great book by the New York Times TV critic, in fact, the best book about Trump, I would say, who sort of basically paints a parallel between Trump's career and the evolution of American television. It's very revealing.
Is it the new book that just came out?
No, it came out a couple of years ago.
Okay.
It's called Audience of One. I'm only mentioning this because Trump had so much to offer, in a sense, as you know, never mind The Apprentice. Whenever Hollywood needed a walk-on for, you know, rich guy who kind of quickly symbolizes something, he was there. Home Alone, for instance, yeah. So if you're Josh Hawley and you're this kind of, you know, technocratic-looking guy who went to, you know, all kinds of elite universities, you don't have that. So Vance obviously has a story, and that's also his big capital. It's a story that's easily comprehensible. Nobody ever really asks questions about it and says, wait a minute, if an African American had written the book that says, my culture is so awful because, you know, we kind of, you know, tell people from generation to generation that poverty is our way of life, people would have said, wait a minute, that sounds pretty racist. You know, that sounds like it's all culture, there's nothing else. But of course, he got away with it. And he has a story. He has something that most of us don't have, which is a Netflix series. So he has a certain, it's not quite the same as Trump's, but he has a certain capital. And quite frankly, this is what, as you can already tell, makes him dangerous.
That's what one of the things I wrote down today is that what's breathtaking about Vance is that he tells a personal story of the government helping him out with food stamps, his grandmother's Social Security, the GI Bill funding his college, and he then stands up and wants to take it all away.
But of course he doesn't say that.
Right.
That's the thing. That again, one of the things that nominally on paper is new is his attempt by a number of politicians and a number of intellectuals to say we have to have a new kind of package of basically a certain type of conservatism in morality, but combined with, call it what you wish, you know, in Europe, you might even call it social democracy of sorts. Problem is, of course, in some cases, they obviously don't mean it. In some cases, you might say, okay, I'm willing to believe that you, intellectual person X, really, you know, has worked this out for themselves. And, you know, in the best scenario, you really, you know, you can really, behind closed doors, are going to give me a story of how you know about all the corruption in Hungary, but it's acceptable because you think, you know, workers get a better deal, which is not true, but never mind. But in that case, the question is, who's going to be behind you? Because Republican Party donors do not like this package. There's no obvious sort of, you know, constituency in terms of actually making this take off in politics. So where's this going to go? And is it not sort of bound to end up in all these basically bad faith exercises?
On that note, two people are asking, in what ways would you critique the Democratic Party in their response to Trump's popular success?
How many hours left? So just the top three.
Okay.
So I think it's generally a mistake to respond to not just Trump, but populism in general, to kind of then resort to a more or less technocratic stance. And to say that, look, the other side, you know, they're always lying, it's all irrational, we are the ones who do rationality, we have the truth. I mean, this again also applies to the media. Many of you are familiar with a particular paper where on the website, you know, it every single time pops up. If you care about the truth, subscribe now. Of course, the truth is then always cheaper every single day by 40% or so. Not everything they say is a lie, necessarily. And you're not doing yourself a favor if you basically tell people, oh, you know, everything they ever have said is wrong, and we are the only ones who are rational, and there's basically no real way of disagreeing with us. Because what that means in practice is that, forgive me if this is a bit more abstract, that then you have sort of two anti-pluralisms confronting each other. The anti-pluralism of the populists who say, there's a real people out there, and we are the only ones who represent it. If you don't agree with us, you're a traitor to the people. And the anti-pluralism of the technocrats who say, there's a singular truth out there, there's a singular rational policy out there, we are the only ones who know it. If you disagree with us, you're basically irrational. Some of you may recall a previous chancellor in this country who said things like this for about 16 years. That actually is a mistake, and it can reinforce the power of the populists, because it gives them an opening to say, wait a minute, you're always telling us that there's no alternative? What do you mean democracy without choices? What do you mean democracy without the people? So it becomes a kind of vicious circle between these two anti-pluralisms, or these two extremes of a kind. The only other thing I say for the sake of brevity is that since I earlier talked about hollowed out parties, at one point, I think it's fair to say the Democratic Party has to revisit what happened this year. And they have to somehow explain what happened before the end of June, what happened after the end of June. I'm not saying this is equivalent to what I was talking about earlier in terms of the GOP having become a personality cult, but something didn't go quite right in terms of internal decision-making on the part of a Democratic Party. So that's why I said earlier on, both parties are hollowed out in a certain way. Both parties, I think, have a problem in terms of, you know, real internal structures. And there must be some different path that avoids the extreme of okay, you can hijack this whole process in the way that Trump, to some degree, did in 2016, or, you know, the old story about smoke-filled rooms, only party elites make decisions without any input. These are not the only possibilities. So just maybe for your consideration, one suggestion made by a colleague in the US recently was to say, okay, rather than having a convention at the end of all this, which is basically a big PR thing, right, where, you know, various pop stars go on stage and, you know, sing or don't sing, and people tell anecdotes and sometimes, you know, truly tragic stories, but still, it's basically meaningless in terms of actual intellectual exchange. Why not have the convention at the beginning and basically have various actors say, look, we think you should go with our top 2 or 3 candidates, and then leave it still to citizens to make their choice, maybe have ranked choice voting, and then you're going to get some kind of outcome where the party does play a role and sort of steers the process in a certain way, without simply saying, oh, it was all predetermined because, you know, the elites made the decision behind the scene. I'm not saying that's the answer to everything or it's a panacea, but I think it's worth thinking about as restructuring what clearly has become a flawed process in many ways.
Well, and revisiting it based on what happened this year to shorten it. Because if it's possible to pull it off in 6 weeks, then it should be possible in the future to pull it off in 6 weeks, right? And not 2 years.
Yeah, but you know, yeah.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on how we can bring back a place of truth that has universal credibility to verify information, echoing the fairness doctrine?
I don't think we can now establish, you know, truth central somewhere, ex nihilo. And as I was trying to say earlier, there are plenty of people whose identities have solidified in such a way that it's going to be very hard to, quote unquote, get them back. I don't think we should ever give up. I think the truly problematic, even scandalous word in a speech by Hillary Clinton in 2016 that everybody remembers, I mean, the speech that everybody remembers was actually not deplorables, because as you can tell by now, I think a lot of things that Trump has done and said are deplorable. A lot of things that his supporters have done and said are deplorable, and there's no harm in saying that. But Hillary Clinton also said they are irredeemable. And I think that's not a very democratic sentiment. I mean, I know it's very, very hard sometimes, but I don't think you should officially say, oh, we're just giving up. No point in talking to people anymore. That's wrong. That's not a good attitude to have in a democracy. So I'm not saying, you know, we should officially give up. But again, what I think actually matters the most, given where we are now, is basically how, since we're mostly talking about the threats from right-wing populism or even right-wing extremist populism, how credible center-right actors behave and what they validate or don't validate. Example, in 2022, the presidential candidate of the Gaullist party in France, Valérie Pécresse, so as mainstream as it can get in the French Fifth Republic, gave a speech where she basically told her supporters that there might be something to the so-called theory of the Great Replacement. In other words, the conspiracy theory that nefarious elites are sending Muslims to Europe to replace real Europeans with Muslims. Big scandal, and she tried to walk it back the next day. But once it had been said, you couldn't really walk it back. And something that many people among her voters would have said, I don't think we want to go there, all of a sudden had become validated as a certain truth. Because people, I mean, none of us, God forbid, you know, here's a dirty secret, even professors, it's not like we're doing research on every single policy question or every single matter in the world day and night. We all rely on certain people who give us cues, who we trust, who we look to in terms of what do they think, how do they decide. Once somebody as crucial as the presidential candidate of a party that is seen as centrist, bourgeois, etc., basically gives people permission to vote for Marine Le Pen, because, you know, why not vote for the original instead of the copy? Once that has happened, you can't undo it. So this is where I would look. And, but we already talked about this, journalists have to basically immediately go in and say, no, we fact-check you, this is wrong, or this is a conspiracy theory. And if they don't do that, that's why we're going to have a problem.
Yeah, we have quite often at our events said we must expect more from our leaders. And I think it is a really important point that especially the moderate leaders and the moderate right leaders in America need to be more vocal. They're slowly coming out, but it's a slow process.
But this is, I'm sure those of you who listened to my colleague Danny Ziblatt maybe earlier this year, he's absolutely right, that if you look at also the history of how democracy took hold or why democracy was destroyed on certain occasions, it wasn't just conservative elites. I mean, plenty of authoritarian left-wing actors as well.
Yeah.
But in crucial moments, how these people positioned themselves was an absolutely decisive factor. And again, timing, as always in politics, matters. It's very nice if Jeff Flake now says, one thing or the other. But it's a bit late, and most people...
Well, he did, and he lost his job.
Well, but most people at this side are going to say, Jeff who?
Yeah.
So that's why it matters to do it in the moment.
Where what Mitch McConnell could have done. Yeah. Okay. We are very close to time. We probably want to end it on a slightly positive note.
Good luck.
Yeah. You talk about the difference between hope and optimism.
It's an old line from Dr. Martin Luther King, that basically optimism ultimately is a certain estimation of probabilities. Here's what you think is going to happen or not going to happen. Hope is about thinking, okay, in principle, certain things remain possible. I have no idea whether they're going to happen or not going to happen. But it at least prevents us from adopting a certain defeatism that, there's nothing that can be done anymore. That's why I was trying to make the point about social media, which, on one hand, of course, can lead you to despair and say, look, we're all screwed as long as Elon keeps amplifying, his own far-right messages and all the million Nazis who are back on his platform. But it's also important to resist, dare I say, the pleasure of determinism, because it still gives you the sense of, at least I know what's going on, as opposed to living with the uncertainty where you say, look, in principle, it might still be possible to do things differently. I don't really know exactly how, so I'm not doing a very good job in terms of having the positive message here. But at least in principle, it's better than this, we're all screwed anyway and nothing can be done, which is the sort of perverse pleasure of pessimism.
We sort of need to have a healthy mix of optimism and hope then, right?
Sure.
On that note.
Look, I tried my best, It's just we are where we are.
No, on that note, before we go, I have a couple of things I want to say. You also end your book, and I left it down there because everyone else, you can read it yourselves, with basically it's up to us. It's up to us. Democracy is all about us. I know you guys engage, that's why you're here. That's what it's all about. And on that note, if you are an American citizen, you can vote. And if you don't have your ballot yet, you should, because they've dropped. And so you can go to votefromabroad.org, and that's all of you watching online too. And it's quick and easy, and you get your ballot. You just put in your state information, and you get it. So if you have not registered to vote, please do. And next time there's an election here, I'll harp on that too.
But you should also, for all the folks watching online, should also make the election integrity statement and re-emphasize that if you're not a citizen, you cannot vote, because plenty of actors in the US are telling us right now this is a massive problem. But Democrats are making all these non-citizens vote. Right?
So votefromabroad.org is nonpartisan, and you have to put your passport in. So there you go. That's my plug. Please vote. And on that note, until the election, we have one more event under the Munich Dialogues umbrella here. We're going to be on the 18th of October. We'll have Cynthia Miller-Idris talking about the far right in more detail and how they recruit and where they recruit and what we can do against that and how they are networked internationally. She's really fabulous. And we're reading her book in our Munich Dialogues book group, and that meeting is the 15th, if you want to come join us. Just go to our website, dialogues.com, dialoguesondemocracy.com, and you can sign up and get the information for what we're doing. So, thank you all very much for coming tonight. A huge thanks to those of you who have donated to make our events possible, and a huge thank to Jan, who flew in this morning and did this for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.